Thank you.
The senator from Vermont is correct. I don't intend to take any action on this now. I know there's events planned tonight. We're in the middle of a mourning here for our lost colleague as well. And so, but I simply wanted to explain for the record what it is that we're attempting to do here. Now, I think all of us are sensitive to the pain and the damage incurred by those in the Northeast due to the catastrophic, clearly catastrophic, record proportion hurricane that hit that sector of our country just weeks ago. And clearly that is something that falls in the category of an emergency. It goes beyond the ability of state and local jurisdictions to address with their own resources. They will participate in the recovery, and they have. It's remarkable in this country, virtually no state, no senator can stand and simply say, well, we haven't been touched, and not understand the need for the response that comes from disasters. Whether they be tornadoes like occurred in my state of Indiana just this past spring, we needed emergency help and response, and we received that. Whether it is flooding that has occurred throughout the Middle West and in other parts of the country that has caused a tremendous amount of damage. Terror attacks such as 9/11, Oklahoma City. In this case, hurricanes, and we've had a number of those. Katrina stands in our mind, but Irene and on it goes, Sandy being the latest. And this one was truly of a monumental proportion and created a lot of damage. And therefore, a federal response is needed and necessary if we're going to begin to have an adequate recovery, get people back to work and back in their homes, businesses up and growing again and working. And the bill that is currently on the floor for us here attempts to do that. Now, some of us were somewhat staggered by the initial number, $60.4 billion. That may not be enough. That may be too much. But in the short amount of time that we've had to try to put all the estimates together in terms of what might be needed, what we have, as Senate appropriation Republicans attempted to do is to separate that from what we believe is immediately needed, immediate being from the time of the storm through March 27th, to attend to those first responder, those initial responses that need to take place, a whole raft of things that run the gamut, from debris cleanup to repairing damaged and flooded facilities, destroyed homes, public facilities, and so forth. But to try to go through and separate the immediate and make sure that that measure of support is quickly and as expeditiously as possible is brought to the area to address the problem from those longer-term projects and interests that have been proposed. Now, when our committee met with, I think, up to 10 senators from the affected states testifying, we heard a number of suggestions about a number of things that ought to be incorporated in this legislation. Mitigation was one major issue. Mitigation simply is preparing for the next storm so we can mitigate or lessen the damage that occurred from the storm that we just incurred. But mitigation is a long-term project. It's not something that can be immediately entered into. And interestingly enough, on the proposals that were presented before the committee, many were contradictory. Some thought that burying wires underground would prevent, obviously, tree limbs from taking down and losing power on above-ground wiring. That, in a city like Manhattan or Boston or major metropolitan area or in any city, is an enormously expensive project. And while that seemed initially to make some success, one of the experts that was testifying said, well, wait a minute. The flooding that occurred with this goes in and would corrode the piping and corrode a lot of the systems and the switches and that might not be the best thing to do. I don't know whether that's better to do or not better to do. But it's certainly something that needs to be examined, carefully vetted, before we commit to that type of project. Others said we rebuild the sand dunes and sand islands offshore to provide barriers. There was a piece, I think it was in the New York Times, that basically said this has shown some real promise in terms of protecting areas by having sand barriers off the coast. Other experts came in and said, well, yes, sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. And you need to be careful how and where you build these. It's not the panacea. It's not the be-all and end-all of how you prevent this type of damage, but it clearly is something that we ought to look at, clearly something we ought to examine. But making a decision now in the weeks aftermath of the storm, here we are just days from adjournment, and saying this is why we need $13 billion toward mitigation projects, without vetting those projects, without examining those, having experts look at it and tell us what they think would work, how much it would cost, setting the priorities of what ought to be first, and what ought to be done, and what perhaps might not work and be postponed. All of that requires a process. And if we're going to be responsible with the taxpayers' dollars at a time of this fiscal crisis, and particularly now, it seems to me the most logical and responsible way to move forward here is identify the immediate needs and provide the immediate funding to address those needs. And secondly, on those needs that are longer term, go through a process. That's why we have committees. That's why we have procedures in place to identify how best to move forward and spend the taxpayer dollars in a useful way that doesn't turn out to be a waste of money and deny us the opportunities to do the mitigation or other repairs that may be needed. The additional funding, of course, this is a short-term proposal. It goes through March 27th. It addresses those needs that fall in that category that meet the criteria of what we set out when we told our staff on the Appropriations Committee to go through and scrub the bill that was put before us and separate out that which was needed now from that which was could be done later. That criteria excluded funding for projects not related to Sandy. Now, there's a long list of requests out there for previous disasters. Mitigation was for future disasters that may or may not come. So on mitigation, we said let's set that aside for later deliberation. On non-related issues, such as cleaning up tsunami debris on the West Coast, those expenditures put in this $60.4 billion proposal by the administration and brought to this Senate floor, if it's not related directly to this storm, let's set those aside for the procedures that it was being dealt with before Sandy occurred, or put those procedures in place to deal with it afterward. So unrelated items and unsubstantiated items, those where all the facts weren't in, where these were estimates that had not been certified and not substantiated in a way that I think gives us puts us in a position to make the correct decisions in terms of going forward. And so under that criteria, we came up with a proposal that totals, it's a little bit of a work in progress, but it totals around $24 billion. Some members here, I'd be happy to yield, but I'd like to finish my remarks if I could, and then I know we all have time commitments.
I'm only going to make a very short unanimous consent request if I can.
I'd be happy to yield to this,
Thank you.
Senator.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that upon the completion of the distinguished senator's remarks that the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Is there objection? Without objection, it is so ordered. Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, the concept behind this, of course, is to be as careful as we can with the taxpayers' money and make sure that each dollar spent is spent on something that has been thoroughly examined and looked at and vetted and scrubbed and determined to be necessary going forward. We have to determine the cost share for the state and local communities, what that percentage ought to be that comes from the state. We have to, and the local communities, as opposed to the federal government. We have to determine how to best go forward with the best project that can hopefully prevent future damage should a second storm or subsequent storm occur. We have to look at a whole number of factors here and make judgments. That's what we're elected to do. When the taxpayer sends their money in to the federal government, they don't want us to just throw up a number and throw some wish list out and throw out money at unsubstantiated and really unscrubbed projects that are proposed. So I'm not suggesting here that everything in the proposal, the $60.4 billion, is not necessary. I'm simply saying, give us some time, at least this 3 months through March 27, to have our committees and have the experts look at these proposals and make sure that it's substantiated. So we remove the unsubstantiated, the mitigated, the non-Sandy related. We've removed all that from this program, and that's how we arrived at this number. Now, I could go through a number of examples. I don't think I need to do that at this particular point in time. When you look at the various categories that this falls in, sometimes we matched exactly what it was in the administration's bill, saying this is an accurate number. Flood insurance, for instance. We require people living in flood zones to buy flood insurance. They buy the flood insurance, and they're looking for their check. So if the estimate has been made, and it's been made actuarially and through the procedures of FEMA and all those evaluating the cost, and the decision is made and the number is determined and certified, then a check is written and those people can move on with their lives. That's an immediate need. We can't tell people, pay your premium, and we'll somehow find a way to get your check to you a year from now. This is an immediate need. And in that regard, we have matched the request made by the flood insurance program to provide the borrowing authority so that they can cut those checks. This is Christmas, after all. And whether it's Christmas or the middle of the year, those people need to get their lives back together, and we want to get that money to them. So as you go down the list here of the categories and compare what we've provided and what has been provided in the larger bill, you find, I think, congruence in a number of areas, but in a number of other areas which I've generalized here in terms of mitigation, in terms of community development block grants. All of these take time to come to fruition, to be put together. The plans need to be vetted and approved. They are not necessary to provide the necessary immediate need and aid that is for the people that are suffering from the consequences of this storm. If you go through all that and scrub it, we arrive at a considerably lower number. But I want it said here that this number, while higher than some would like and lower than others would like, is a thought-through, carefully thought-through, reasonable number to take care of needs for now through this Christmas season and all the way to March 27. This Congress will then revisit, and during that time, that matter and what else is needed. But during that time, we'll be able to also carefully work through the estimates, substantiate those estimates, certify that, and then I think, obviously, those proposing will have a much better foundation to stand on in terms of what they're requesting. And those of us who are trying to be very careful of the taxpayers' dollars will be able to assert or state why we think that this may not be necessary at this time, or perhaps doesn't fall in the category of being related to Sandy or is thrown out. We all know when some emergency supplemental comes to the halls of Congress, a lot of people reach in the pocket, pull out the wish list, waiting for the next train. That has to be something we'll move through quickly, has to be signed by the president because it's designated as an emergency, and throw on their wish list of unresolved, unfunded projects that perhaps are legitimate, perhaps maybe just earmarks or something that needs a train to hook onto in order to get passed. That's what we want to try to avoid. So, as I said, I will be filing this amendment, which hopefully will be seen as an alternative to give members a choice in terms of how best to move forward in dealing with this legitimate supplemental emergency provision. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Pursuant to the previous order, the Senate now